are now. So we are recording, which is allowed in New Hampshire as long as it's acceptable as long as participants are notified. All right, and now to our sessions. I'd like to introduce Elena Pascarella, who works in the Office of Assessment and Curriculum Affairs at University of Arizona Global Campus, overseeing the implementation of the DEI Course Audit rubric, and serves as a QM coordinator for UAGC, as well as applying the QM rubric online facilitator. Elena has presented at the IUPUI Assessment Institute on topics pertaining to general education and institutional learning outcome assessment planning, as well as UAGC's annual teaching and learning conference. So I will turn it over to Elena now.
Hi, everyone. I hope you're as excited to see this tool as I am to present it. So just sort of a brief agenda of what we're going to talk about today. We want to get into first why, sort of the setting and theories that we used as we were developing the rubric, how we developed it, our training of faculty and resources that we've used, as well as sort of the implementation, practice, and dissemination. And we'll walk through some key pieces of the rubric. So first, I just want to give you sort of a brief overview of our student population. Our mission statement is to provide a community of caring and guidance for academic, financial, mental health, and career support while providing a path that makes quality education accessible to adult learners through online flexible degree and certificate programs. So you can sort of see from the charts below, a lot of our population at University of Arizona Global Campus, we have a majority minority. A majority of our students are non-white, majority female. Most of them are working full-time. And so as we're really sort of looking at how we were teaching these students and providing curriculum, we wanted to really use a lens of what matters, because a lot of our students are first-generation college students. And so we wanted to really cultivate this idea that everyone learns, as well as cultivating relationships between each other. And this is really core to our process. So the process for the rubric is a very collegial process. It's about collaboration. It's about discussing these issues with other faculty members, making sure that we align our institutional resources to that and believing that improvement matters. So as I'll talk about later, this iteration of the rubric that I'm showing you is version 32 of however many there will be, because we recognize that this is a process of continuous improvement. So we're never going to sort of have all of the answers, but the fact that we're looking at them is a good place to start. So one of the needs that we saw as we were talking about this, we saw this being especially important, not only because of some comments that we had received from external reviewers as part of our program review process, but as we looked at sort of the events of 2020, particularly the summer of 2020, the George Floyd murder, and all of sort of that social unrest that was happening, we really saw a need to provide support to our students who were affected by those incidences, and that was sort of what they were dealing with as part of their narrative. And so we wanted to have sort of this ongoing conversation around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it's more so beyond just access, providing equal access to our students, but providing equal opportunity for success. So it really sort of looked beyond that. And so we developed the Change Advisory Group, which was a group that were essentially tasked with how do we address these DEI principles at our institution, not just in curriculum, but across the institution as a whole, and really started to have sort of these informed, meaningful conversations around this. We started a discussion group called Turn the Tide, which is faculty and staff getting together to have these important conversations about what is going on in the world around us as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion, looking at different topics such as race, gender equality, and gender identity and orientation, looking specifically at socioeconomic status, because it is something that affects our students heavily, as almost 70% of our student population qualifies for Pell. So it was one of those. And the other is this course audit rubric. And we really wanted to anchor our thoughts in sort of what's going on in educational theory. Now, the first one we looked at is critical learning theory, Paulo Freire, who really believed that education had to be centered on developing critically conscious, humanized learners. And those learners would act to liberate themselves and the world from injustice. So it is this idea about education as leading social transformation. And we either can educate to support and maintain the status quo, or we can choose to educate to help critique and change reality if the status quo is not being equitable for all people involved. The other area that we really focused on was this idea of sociocultural learning. So of course, this comes from Lev Vygotsky, where it suggests, his theory suggests that our environment plays a crucial role in who we are as learners and how we develop. And so our need to reflect sort of the environment into the culture of the courses that we're teaching, because peers have the power to influence how a learner thinks or feels about a particular subject. And we similarly have to take into consideration how we as instructors and faculty delivering this course content have the power to partner with students as learners. And so it sort of breaks down a lot of this, some of this hierarchy that we see of instructor, student, and putting us both on the same level as learners and learning together. And so we really wanted to look at a lot of the educational benefits of diversity, including raising racial and cultural awareness, enhancing critical thinking, developing a variety of communication skills, developing higher levels of service to the community, and really looking at creating a more educated citizenry and those involved in civic engagement. Inclusion, really getting to looking at how our students act as a campus community. We at University of Arizona Global Campus, because we are 100% online institution, sort of creating that campus community becomes a more difficult ball game because we have students spread across the country. We also have a lot of military students who are out of the country serving serving the United States. And so we have this need to create a cohesive campus community over a lot of distance. And this is also particularly important to historically underrepresented and marginalized populations who a lot of times they're considered to be at risk, but we like to think of them as being at potential. And so looking at how we can not only include them in this greater campus environment, but achieve parity in student educational outcomes, regardless of all of these extraneous demographic details. So making sure that everyone has the ability to succeed. So what we decided to do is we really wanted to take a look at our course curriculum to ensure that all of our students felt represented and heard within the classroom, that we started researching and drafting the DEI course audit rubric in a small work group. We sought out faculty for feedback. So, wrong screen. So the intent of the rubric is to develop sort of a greater consciousness regarding DEI issues within the curriculum, not only so that we can celebrate our achievements and where we're doing well, but understand where we're falling short and where we're not serving our students to the best of our ability. Now, using this rubric, a faculty reviewer explores all aspects of our course to evaluate how much DEI representation that course manifests. So we based our rubric and research on our diversity, equity, and inclusion statement, our institutional learning outcomes, NACE career readiness competencies, as well as the Department of Ed's description of global and culturally competent individuals and what that looks like in our students. We visited each department in the university, both faculty and staff, to get feedback that we would take to the Change Advisory Group, as well as our faculty council and all of its subcommittees. We then engaged in a pilot project where we had 38 faculty review 19 courses, and we trained faculty on how to use the rubric, including calibration. And finally, we came to what we're currently using is our 30-second version of the DEI course audit rubric that was approved by our curriculum and assessment steering committee, as well as faculty council. And our target goal is to have reviewed all of our courses by the end of 2024. Now, in order to train our faculty, of course, we were like, how do we scale this? We are a fairly large institution. We have hundreds of faculty who are across the United States. So making sure that all of our faculty had access to this and access to training, we partnered with our Center for Excellence in Teaching and Learning to create professional development activities. We looked at a needs analysis. We visited with faculty from the pilot to figure out what's the best way to roll this out. We created a training, which we use Rise by Articulate. It's in our workday, and it is available for all employees. So regardless of whether you're a faculty member, you can serve as an external reviewer on this important project. And so all faculty and staff are then sort of responsible for implementing this. We also created additional resources for faculty around DEI in our course design cafe, which all of our faculty have access to, course development training, which all faculty undergo who are developing courses, our course guide development template, as well as a weekly series that we do called the Development Dish with Jen and Trish, where faculty come together to discuss issues that they're having in the course development process. If they have an issue related to DEI and they're not sort of sure how best to implement that in the course that they're teaching, like they can talk to other faculty. 1 hour every Tuesday, we get together in Zoom and have sort of those conversations around course development. We also have an ongoing course development series that meets once a month, where we deep dive into all of the different components of course development. And so we want to make sure that we're partnering not only with our full-time faculty, but our associate faculty, which most of them are called, most institutions call them adjunct faculty, that because they're all teaching the same course. So we also work from a master shell model, where if a student is taking English 225, every teacher teaching that course has the exact same curriculum to teach from. So we are able to sort of control curriculum sort of in that way to ensure that this is happening broadly across the institution, regardless of who is teaching that course and the curriculum. So as we sort of think about this from a practitioner standpoint, we want to think about first, like, will it work for our students? Well, part of this rubric that I'm going to be showing you specific pieces of comes from a multiple intelligence approach to evaluation. So it's not only looking for diversity, equity, and inclusion in terms of the big pieces that we see sort of on the surface that we tend to go to, but are we providing students with choice that regardless of their learning style or their whatever multiple intelligences they come from, Gardner's theory, that they're able to demonstrate mastery in the course? It also sort of reveals opportunities within our curriculum to scaffold our design. Like, where are we missing the pieces where students maybe need to start at a smaller piece throughout the course and move to a bigger one. We also want to make sure that we're being equitably appealing, cultural inclusivity. Every student has access to mastery. And it really allows us to highlight places in our curriculum where we can differentiate. A lot of what we came from as we've been evolving, as we develop courses, is that we had sort of a very standard course design, 2 discussions per week online in the learning management system and a written assignment. And that was sort of what happened throughout every course, regardless of subject matter. And we're moving away from sort of that standard sort of discussion assignment model and looking at how we can engage students where they're at and allow for choice in how students demonstrate mastery, and really differentiating that curriculum, not only in our assessments, but in our course materials. And it also really allows us to focus on the high impact practice of diversity and global learning. So the next thing, which is usually the question that we get asked a lot, is, will it cost me more time or cause me to do more work? We understand faculty have a lot on their plates. And so we wanted to look at, are we creating a process that is prohibitive for our faculty in addressing these curricular issues? And it does take a little bit more time upfront, but the upfront investment ends up providing bigger dividends on the back end. So the time sort of spent evaluating our course content allows us to uncover gaps and opportunities to make changes in our course revision process that we can then use to enhance the student experience. And so while we may spend a little more time up front, it gives us specific areas to focus on when we're doing our course development. So is this sort of a thing that we're only sort of visiting? Well, that depends on what you want to do with it. We have it as an institutional initiative. It could be an individual initiative for specific faculty. You can do this at the department, program, or college level. This rubric sort of offers the ability to have an open PLC, or have it affect you not only in face-to-face, but online course design. And is it adaptable to my style? Because we recognize that faculty teach in different ways, and different faculty have sort of different expectations. We have 29 indicators in this particular rubric that allows for some customization, as well as the ability to collaborate and brainstorm ideas in sort of our process. And we hope that it ultimately promotes critical thinking. So the rubric and the process itself. Now we're getting sort of down to the nitty-gritty. Like, what does this look like? So we have 9 specific standard areas with 29 different indicators and 5 evaluation categories, evaluation being the performance levels. Faculty engage in a pre-work self-assessment of where they think their course is. We also ask faculty to pair with another faculty member or staff member for an external review. And the only thing that we ask for that external review is that the faculty reviewing the course not be within the course subjects program. So we ask that maybe one of our liberal arts faculty pairs with one of our business faculty, or health sciences pair with education. We just really want it to be outside of that area of expertise. But we found a lot of times with that external reviewer coming without having sort of that subject matter expertise, they look at it from a student's lens. So they're looking at this content from at the first time, as though they were a student sort of engaging in this in the first time. And that has really led to some very fruitful conversations in our post-review conference. So they complete the rubric, and then faculty members faculty members or staff members, whoever completed the reviews, get together to talk about their results and what changes specifically can be made as a result of that. So the 9 standards on our DEI rubric, we have our course support components, which is our course guide, or a lot of times that would be a syllabus. Then we have our course learning support outcomes, looking specifically at what are the learning outcomes in the course and how do they represent DEI. Course learning support, our access to academic support. So do they have access to like our writing center, our library, tutoring? What do those supports look like? Then we specifically have sort of our nitty-gritty of the course. What are the activities that they're actually doing in the course? What do their quizzes and exams look like? And how are we providing them opportunities to master the course learning outcomes? And then finally, we look at course learning resources. This is specifically our textbooks, our videos, articles that are being provided to the students to help them master the course learning outcomes. And then finally, what images that we have in the course. Because we are an online institution, the images that we see in the course are very important, especially as we've noticed that a lot of our faculty demographics do not represent our student demographics. Students maybe aren't going to see themselves, particularly in the faculty member, because a lot of our faculty skew white male, to be honest. And that's something that we're looking to address as part of our other HR initiatives and change advisory group. But how do we represent our students in the images that they see in the course? So I want to go through just a couple of categories in this rubric before I sort of open it up for questions. And this will be a spot where we can participate in the chat, because I'm interested to see sort of how you might evaluate, especially in this first part. So this is the DEI rubric course component for learning outcomes. How we look at our learning outcomes. The first category being, this is our distinguished, we're developing, we're emerging, and we're not sort of seeing any reflection or respect to openness of new perspectives and diverse cultural views. So how do the learning outcomes, we are, yes, Barbara, to answer this, we are defining DEI to include accessibility. So it's not just looking specifically at like race, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, socioeconomic status, sort of all those big pieces, but also looking at, is it accessible to our students? So we have that built into a lot of our definitions that we include with this rubric. So these are just sort of our performance levels. And I want to look specifically at English 225, just because this is a course that I helped do a review of. And these are the learning outcomes for English 225, which is our introduction to film course as part of our Gen Ed sequence. And so I want you to look at these 6 learning outcomes. And as you sort of think about them, are there ways that we can address DEI within these course learning outcomes, and where we might think this would fall on a scale of they do it really well, they kind of do it, they barely touch the surface, or they don't address or can't possibly be made to address anything related to diversity, equity, and inclusion within the course without necessarily spelling out those words. So this will require a little bit of critical thinking and thinking about how we might look at these. Any thoughts from anyone in the chat looking at these? Are there ways to address diversity, equity, inclusion in the way that these learning outcomes are written? I'll give it just a couple minutes, and then I'll go with what I answered. Okay, so I said that this is somewhat of a reflection. There are opportunities within particularly, and I'll go to what I said. So the course learning outcomes as they're written don't specifically call out diversity, equity, and inclusion, but there is room to address them within the course learning outcomes as they're written, particularly the CLO 5 and 6, where students are asked how we interpret the meaning of films through various critical lenses. There are so many different lenses we can look at film that'll give us a lot of those diverse perspectives, and how film relates to society, and being able to bring in some of those diverse perspectives of sort of those films that have big meaning, and how that can change perspectives and how we relate as a society to what we see in film. I think particularly about sort of the Marvel movies. I'm a big nerd. And so how we've seen over the years in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, more diversity coming in, more people are able to see themselves in the superheroes we see on screen. Captain Marvel being the first female-led superhero movie, Black Panther with an all African-American cast directed by an African-American director, was sort of a big cultural moment. When we get into some of the stuff going on in phase 4, we have Asian American representation, the Eternals sort of all over the place in terms of the diversity of their cast. So we're seeing sort of how that can affect images and how that affects society. Now, the next one I want to look at is course learning activities. And this is where we get into, are we giving students, and this is specifically looking at, are we giving students the opportunity to demonstrate understanding of the complexity of the elements that are important to members of diverse groups? So are we representing different groups' histories, values, politics, communication styles, beliefs, practices, and giving respect to sort of those diverse perspectives in our assignments, and asking our students to look at those. And this specifically excludes exams and quizzes, because we look at those in a different element. So for the assignments for this course, there were 3 written assignments. Our undergraduate courses are 5 weeks in length, and that there's some moderate opportunities for them to demonstrate sort of a basic understanding. The 3 written assignments, the final assignment is a sort of a cultivation of the course, where they pick a film to do a critique on from a very specific critical lens. And so they're given a wide list of films to look at that include a lot of diverse perspectives. The course developers did really well in that particular area in terms of the films that they gave our students that they can look at for this particular assignment. But a lot of them didn't specifically call out issues related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So in the reflection, first I wanted to look at the auteur theory, which is the week 3 assignment, and it doesn't necessarily lend itself to this lens of DEI. Auteurs, of course, are directors that have a very sort of specific style, but some of them work very specifically with stories within their own communities and various identities. And so we could address this more. Does the director that we're looking at specifically, do their works reflect the communities in which they live and the various identities within? I think of a director like Spike Lee, who does a lot of stories about the African-American community, specifically in New York, where he is from. Of course, we think of, Do the Right Thing, which was sort of his first seminal work that really sort of brought Spike Lee to the forefront of film. We also have room in the week 5 assignment specifically to address where students are looking at the impact of the film on society. what does it mean for a Latino child to go and see themselves represented in a superhero on screen? In America, like in America Chavez, who is in the new Multiverse of Madness Marvel movie. I keep going back to superhero movies because they're totally on my brain. But what impact does that have on society as a whole to see themselves reflected in those heroes? Week 2 deals specifically with genre films and what specific tropes that are used in genre. Now, are there tropes within that genre that include stereotypes? Asking students to specifically look at potential stereotypes in their chosen genre. Westerns have historically been known to have negative stereotypes of Native populations and populations of Indigenous people. What impact does that have on how we view those films? Or we look historically at gangster movies. What impact do those stereotypes have on how we perceive Italian Americans? When we look at that, and how does that shape how we think about the world around us? And so there were these places where we could specifically address DEI without necessarily calling it out specifically in the course learning outcomes, but the way they're written lends itself to that. The next area, discussion forums, looking specifically again at these course learning activities. Again, we saw it to be sort of a moderate area for that. There's areas to improve. And as I was doing this for the course developer, going through very specifically each week. So week 1, students are asked to introduce themselves and talk about how film impacted them. Like, that's a great way to sort of break the ice, because it allows students choice, but also allows them to examine their own cultural experience of film. Like, how do they see film? How do they go to the movies? Do they stream it on their Netflix, or do they actually still go to the cinema? And how does that change how we perceive film? Week 2 focuses a lot on lighting and editing. So as we look at sort of the film industry, there's been a lot of conversation about how we light for different skin tones, as many of the traditional techniques are specifically geared for white actors. So how do can we incorporate some of this into how students are talking about lighting within a particular film? Week 3, we had a lot of different movie clips here from groups of individuals represented. So it was a very strong discussion. But talking about, so next, week 4, talking about actors and casting. There is a huge discussion, obviously, in sort of the cultural zeitgeist about the historical context of casting white actors to play non-white characters, whitewashing certain characters by changing the ethnicity, having cis hetero actors playing individuals in the LGBTQ community, or abled actors playing characters who are differently abled. So hearing actors playing deaf characters. The fact that Coda, a film that has a predominantly deaf cast, won Best Picture is sort of a big deal, because typically those types of roles would go to hearing actors, who then have to learn sign language and learn a lot of the cultural nuances around deafness, but they're not actually representing the deaf community itself. A big deal was made with West Side Story, the new version with Steven Spielberg, because he cast Latinx actors as the Puerto Rican characters in West Side Story, which the 1961 version, which is a fine version, most of those characters were played by white actors in what we call brownface. So their makeup was darkened in order to make them appear Puerto Rican. So much so that Rita Moreno, who played Anita in the original version of West Side Story, who was Puerto Rican, was made to darken her face with makeup to match the skin tones of her white actors whose skin tone had been darkened. And so there's ability to have a discussion around that within the classroom. That was sort of an area that we missed. Week 5, looking at, the sociocultural effect of film and how it impacts our social, our understanding of social issues and concerns. Like, this is a place where students would be given an opportunity to really explore a variety of perspectives on culture and society, and how film affects us and how it affects our understanding of different cultures. And so as we sort of had this conversation around this, what we came to the conclusion of, especially as I was meeting with the course developer, is that there's a lot of opportunity to allow students to explore perhaps some of their own biases about different cultures, different experiences other than their own, that have been ingrained in them based on sort of this Western culture canon of film, and how we look at and how film shapes how we understand others, for sort of good or bad. So a lot of this, we have, of course, to just sort of sum up, we have unlimited benefits. This, like, it affects how we structure our content, how we present our content, how we're culturally inclusive in our courses, different instructional techniques and methods, and how we implement that in an online course, which can be very difficult, and allows us to sort of scaffold across that and differentiate, not only for accessibility for our students, but looking at our courses really from a universal design perspective, and making sure that, although we have said that we are looking, as we develop our courses from a UDL perspective, that we're actually doing it and having this checkpoint to see that. So I'm going to open it for questions, or any thoughts sort of people have. If the rubric is something, our faculty in the external review process using all 9 standards to assess, or just 5 through 0. So we have sort of 9 areas in the rubric, and then the 5 through 0 is the performance evaluation level. So it's like our Likert scale. They use all 9 standards to assess the course, and then they go through that based on and determine where each standard is and each subcategory under that standard. So you have your course learning outcomes, or your learning outcomes standard. Underneath that, we have both the course learning outcomes as well as any weekly learning outcomes that we have for the course. So those are examined as 2 different substandards under that main standard of learning outcomes, and it's assessed individually. Same with learning activities. We look at, so you have learning activities as your broad standard, then, which they do on their Likert scale of 5 to 0. Then looking at specifically written assignments, discussion boards, interactive assignments that they may have, journals that students may have to write. And then we specifically separate out exams and quizzes, and looking at how the formative exams are structured, how the summative exams are structured, and if there's any sort of final exams in the course. So we do separate out, all 9 standards are used, and then they use this Likert scale of transforming, developing, emerging, not observed, and not applicable, because there are some bits of the course where some of our courses have standardized instructor guidance in our courses, some don't. And so if they don't, you can't observe that. And so that's sort of where we have sort of that different scale. So you might in some cases have that 6. Yes, course supports, they would be able to examine our course supports. So we ask that they look at, all of the different pieces, and our course supports are things like our instructor guidance, weekly lectures, course videos that may be standard to the course rather than that are standard to the course that are made by our ed tech team as part of the course design, rather than like a video from YouTube that the instructor may have students watch for whatever reason. But we do really look to in terms of that for accessibility. If it's a rubric, so this is the exciting part. Before, this rubric was simply internally. We are starting to share this rubric out with other institutions. So if you want to, if you would like to see sort of the full rubric, or partner with us for implementing something similar in your own institutions, the only thing we ask is that you partner with us to perhaps act as external reviewers on some of our courses. We can act as external reviewers on some of your courses. So have sort of that collegial thing. We're not sort of fully open access with it, but it is something that if you're interested, you can email me at elena.pascarella@uagc.edu, and we can have that talk about how we sort of navigate that external review process. But that's sort of the only thing that we're asking as we sort of look at that particular rubric. And I did only show a couple of areas within the rubric, just because it is a very sort of long document. When you have 9 standards and substandards underneath that, it gets to be a little wieldy for a presentation of this length.
Any other questions for Elena?
Any tips for how to assess STEM courses? We're using this in our STEM courses. We have courses in computer technology. We have a program in IT. We have a program in computer software development and cyber and data security. And we designed this sort of rubric to be able to be used in any course. I specifically was using a gen ed course just because it was a course I was familiar with and familiar with that process. But we've used it in our business courses because it is sort of very general. And I know like it can get difficult sometimes because certain areas have been dominated by certain voices in terms of course resources and accessibility. And so it may be a case where if we see a problem with a resource that we consistently see sort of the same faces presenting this information, that perhaps we create something at the university from one of our faculty members who is in STEM, but doesn't necessarily represent what we see sort of typically in that area. And so we look at how we can start changing the system by creating our own resources that we can then share with other institutions so that students can see themselves more reflected in that, because we're making an attempt to hire a more diverse faculty background in a lot of those areas. And so if it comes to the point where we see a lot of white faces talking about mathematics, maybe it's time that one of our faculty members who is not a white male creates a tool that they can use in their class or a video about how to do something that we just create it because we do have a little bit more diversity. And so making sure that we contribute to that outside, but it can be difficult because there are certain areas that certain voices have predominantly been heard. And so part of this is figuring out where we need to maybe make our own resources so that other voices can be heard as well. And elevate those other voices so that it isn't just sort of an echo chamber in those areas.
Well, we've hit 4 o'clock, so this was great. Thank you so much for sharing this with us.
Thank you. I hope everyone has a great rest of your day.
Bye. Thank you so much.